So everyone, I guess, can see my PowerPoint. Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about the Neo-Impressionists today, and mostly I'm going to use paintings from the permanent collection at the Dixon, which is really cool that I'm able to do that for this talk. So I just wanted to give a little bit of background on why I picked this topic to talk about today. So some of you probably know, but some of you probably don't, that we're working on a new permanent collection catalog for all of the, well, we'll be highlighting about 100 works from the Dixon's permanent collection. And I'm one of the 4 people who is contributing catalog entries on each of these select works of art from the collection. So I am the person who's written, I think, all of the entries concerning artists who have some affiliation to Neo-Impressionism. So I chose that because I've learned a lot about it from working on this project. And I thought it would be cool to share some of what I've learned about these paintings. So I'm going to start now. So Neo-Impressionism is the term that was given to this movement, and it was named by an art critic, Felix Fenion, who you'll hear me reference a couple other times. And he used this term to describe the work of Georges Seurat, Paul Signac, and Camille and Lucien Pisarro at the 8th and final Impressionist exhibition in 1886. So Neo-Impressionism then became the official label for those artists who were working to push beyond what the Impressionists had done before them. So sometimes when you hear a term referred to as neo something, that can mean it's a revival of that style. So this is not one of those instances. This is just like neoclassical would be an example of that, where there's a revival of the classical style. So Neo-Impressionists were actually doing something really different from the Impressionists, but because in 1886, when this term is invented, there were still a lot of artists who were painting in the Impressionist style. So therefore, when this newer different aesthetic came about, there needed to be a new label for it. So led by Georges Seurat, who I have his most famous painting on the screen right now. So led by him, a small group of artists worked to develop a technical and conceptual approach to painting that incorporated scientific and optical theories of the period in an attempt to create the most luminous or light-filled paintings possible. So a lot of this is about color theory. So using unblended pigments placed in a methodical and uniform arrangement on a canvas, the idea behind this technique was that the viewer's eyes would mix the colors together themselves in a way that would resemble the effects, being joined by my dog, in a way that would resemble the effects of real light and color that separate touches of interwoven pigment, and it would result in a greater vibrancy in these canvases. So Paul Signac, who I have a detail of one of his paintings on the left side of the screen right now, I'll talk about him more today, and his biggest claim to fame in terms of Neo-Impressionism is he was just the great promoter of the movement. He really did a lot to publicize what these artists were doing. And he said that, quote, "the separated elements will be reconstituted into brilliantly colored lights," end quote. So that's how he described what they were doing. So you can see in this detail of one of his paintings, this shadowy portion of grass. So Signac is interspersing the green of the grass with dots of different colors of blue. And that's because these are the shadow colors, which come from the complementary colors of the light. So if you look at the color wheel that I have, you can see that when you're looking at the colors that we tend to think of as being associated with light, so like these yellows and oranges, when you go across on the wheel, those are their complementary colors. So we'll think of the blues, and sometimes it even goes into the purples and the reds as being the shadows that these artists are going to use. So the effect is really noticeable, particularly, I hope you can see my mouse, in this little triangular rock that's jutting up right here. So the lit side, which you can see right here, It's glowing in the sunset, and there's dots of orange and yellow and even some pinks and reds. And the shadowed side on the back is mostly in dark blues, which is the complement of the color orange. And so together, this creates kind of a convincing illusion of a rock that's being bathed in sunlight and then the shadow that's there on the backside. So Seurat called this movement chromoluminarism, but sometimes you'll hear this aesthetic with the tiny dots called pointillism, and that's just referencing the application of paint in small dots. But actually, the artists who practiced this style didn't like it being called pointillism. And so a lot of them would refer to it as divisionism, and that's just a more general reference to the separate strokes of pigment that appear on a canvas, as well as the term they would use for their unblended colors in the palette. So they're not mixing colors together, they're taking pure colors of paint straight from the tube and putting them onto the canvas. So who were these artists? Most of the artists who practiced this style were a generation younger than the Impressionists, but they would have been really familiar with the work of the Impressionists. And like I said earlier, Impressionism is still very much a thing that's happening at this time period. So like the Impressionists before them, the Neo-Impressionists wanted to depict contemporary subjects that were often set outdoors, and they wanted to capture the light and the color of a specific time and place. But unlike the Impressionists, the Neo-Impressionists based their mechanical technique of applying dots of color on scientific principles. And they renounced what the Impressionists were doing, which was trying to capture and create a more spontaneous look. So, oh, and this, I forgot I added this in, just so you could see all these separate little dots. So here's a detail from Le Grand Jatte, and you can see in this close-up that it really is just lots of little dots of color that from far away, your eyes kind of piece them together. So here I wanted to just use this slide to briefly compare what's happening that's different, but also highlight what's similar. So on the left, there's a painting by Renoir that you're probably pretty familiar with. And in each of these paintings, you can see that the artist is depicting outdoor leisure time. And there's even a few pets. There's some dogs in each of the paintings. And the artist had the same ultimate goal, which was to capture the effect of light on a sunny afternoon and showing people socializing. But Renoir's loose brushwork reinforces his seemingly spontaneous composition and the idea that he painted this rather quickly before the light changed, while Seurat's execution is more methodical and mechanical, and it seems kind of almost unnaturally still. And you can also just think about the significant amount of time it would have taken Seurat to create this. I didn't include dimensions, but if you've not seen this painting in Chicago, it's really, really large, like over life size. So even if it weren't that large, it would have taken a significant amount of time when you're just in there painting tiny little dots and daubs of color. So the Dixon's collection contains examples of works of art by the artists who are generally considered the major figures of the movement. And so today, using mostly works from our own collection, I'm going to talk about Neo-Impressionism. So I'll talk about Seurat, Signac, Henri Edmond Cross, Maximillian Luc, and a little bit I'll talk about Pisarro, just because he did have a brief affiliation with the movement. But you have to start with Seurat. So he was a prolific artist despite having a really short career that ended with a sudden, unexpected death when he was just 31 years old. He worked in a number of different styles and he was classically, academically trained, but it's his techniques that look like this, where he's using the small dots of color, divisionism, chromoluminarism, as he called it, that he's most easily recognized and best remembered for. So his technique of painting in those small touches of paint in various shapes in a wide spectrum of often unexpected colors launched the 26-year-old artist into the spotlight when his Sunday afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jatte debuted at the 8th and final Impressionist exhibition in 1886. This large, ambitious, and highly formalized painting is arguably the most historically significant to come out of that exhibition, and it remains this artist's best known work. So with the unveiling of this painting, both the press and the Impressionists, most of whom were about 20 years older than he, acknowledged Seurat as the champion of this new and rebellious movement that later the art critic and friend of Seurat, Felix Fenion, called Neo-Impressionism, so we say in English Neo-Impressionism. So Seurat and his colleagues were pushing beyond Impressionism into experimental new territory. And he worked on his major canvases in the studio, so like this one mostly would have been painted in a studio, if not entirely, but he executed hundreds of painted sketches en plein air. So the Picnic, which is in the Dixon's collection, is an example of this type of work that Seurat would have painted outdoors, probably as a study for a larger work. So it's small in size, quickly executed, but carefully studied in terms of its composition and color placement. And these intimate sketches actually greatly outnumbered the number of finished canvases that Seurat created in his lifetime. So the Picnic is about 6 by 10 inches in size. And Seurat called these small paintings, which were painted on wood board, and actually sometimes he painted these on the tops of cigar boxes. He called them croqueton, which hopefully you can see it. I don't know if it's blocked by the images of people on the side, but he called these croquetons, which is a term that scholars think Seurat invented, but it translates loosely to sketchet. So these were both durable and easily portable and convenient for working quickly on site when you were outdoors. So it would have been just really small, easy to carry, and easy to pack up and take with you. So despite a few instances in which Seurat primed these panels with white paint, he largely painted directly onto the wood, and he even used the tone of the wood as a kind of color in his canvas. So you can even see this in the Picnic that you're looking at now, particularly just kind of interspersed throughout, but especially in the upper portion of the painting, in that dark kind of orangish brown color, is the unvarnished wood the varnished wood that's beneath it. So in this panel, Seurat depicts a group of 3 children seated in a park-like setting. He has simplified their features, focusing instead on applying dabs of color in a studied palette to create an overall luminous effect. So though this one is comprised of looser brush strokes than you would see in some of his, I don't want to use the word finished because this is finished, but in one of his works on canvas that he created in his studio, you'll see this has looser brushwork. You can still see his interest in optical mixtures and color theory, as is his preference for depicting scenes of outdoor leisure. So later, Seurat would translate these croquetons into passages of his larger canvases. And we know that several studies like this one survive, whose compositions he later incorporated into some of his most famous larger works. I'm pretty sure there's about 40 of these that have been able to be connected with Le Grand Jatte. So in some instances, he even would exhibit these sketchettes alongside his larger finished canvases. So Seurat really liked these and was really proud of them. These are not studies or sketches that he would have not wanted to show to people. He really was kind of fond of these. So with the Picnic, it's unclear what larger canvas that this might have been a study for, or even if it was. But nonetheless, it's a brilliant example of one of Seurat's most favored methods of production. So now I'll move on to talking about Paul Signac. And I just have to say, not that this is relevant, but I've really loved getting to learn about Signac through this project. I didn't know much about him at all before doing this, and he's just one of the most connected artists I've ever studied. He was hugely influential to a lot of artists who came after him. So I've really enjoyed learning about him. So Neo-Impressionism was never a movement that was made up of artists who worked in an entirely uniform style, but Signac was undoubtedly the figure who fostered a sense of unity between the number of artists to whom the term has been ascribed. So he was born into a pretty wealthy family. His father inherited a business where he made luxury saddles. He had even made some for Napoleon. So his family's wealth gave him financial independence that he enjoyed for his entire life, and this gave him the freedom to pursue an artistic career without having to be concerned about how much money he was making or wasn't making. So he did briefly study in the studio of a minor academic artist, but other than this, he didn't have any academic training. And instead, he cared a lot more about, beginning when he was a teenager, frequenting the various galleries around Paris where he grew up and studying the work of the artists who were his idols. So this would be like Caillebotte or Degas, both Manet and Monet. And as an adolescent, he was drawn to these impressionist paintings that hung in gallery windows near his neighborhood. He frequented the impressionist exhibitions and smaller gallery shows that would feature the work of these artists. And he actually attributed his decision to become a painter to seeing Claude Monet's paintings at the June 1880 exhibition in the offices of La Vie Moderne. So when he first started painting in around 1881 or 82, when he was only 18, he set out not just to become a painter, but to become an impressionist specifically. And this is on the screen an example of one of his early works before he became friends with Seurat. So Signac was confident, outgoing, and generally well-liked, qualities that by the mid-1880s enabled him to assemble a large circle of friends and acquaintances, both artistic and literary, within the Parisian avant-garde. He met Georges Seurat at the founding of the Société des Artistes Indépendants in 1884, and the two personalities meshed so well that Signac became Seurat's closest artistic companion for the remainder of his life. So Signac was about 4 years older than Seurat, excuse me, I'm in that backwards. Seurat was about 4 years older than Signac, and he had extensive academic training. So Seurat introduced Signac to his color theories and his techniques, while the more gregarious Signac facilitated the pair's continued involvement with the coterie of artists and writers whose shared ideas and fellowship would be a boon to him throughout his career. So during his lifetime, Seurat did attract more attention from critics than Signac, but Signac's name and his paintings were frequently referenced alongside his friends, and significantly, Signac was mentioned along with Seurat in Félix Fenion's important article in 1886, where he coined the term Neo-Impressionism. So I'm just going to briefly say something about this society that was founded in 1884. So the subsequent salons that were held ended up being really important spaces to showcase the works of the Neo-Impressionists, and continued even after Neo-Impressionism was no longer the style majorly practiced by the group. So similar to the Impressionist exhibitions, the Salon des Indépendants was not a juried show, and you didn't have these same kind of strict rules and regulations of the traditional, more conservative Paris salon. So that's why it was founded. Okay, so Signac loved spending time at the sea and was particularly fond of sailing. According to his records, he owned more than 30 sailboats. And in keeping with these interests, he favored seascapes and coastal views for his paintings. So in 1885, Signac spent his summer at Saint-Briac-sur-Mer, a commune on the coast of Brittany. So keep in mind that he would have already befriended Signac prior to painting this work. So it was here when he was in Saint-Briac in Brittany that he painted this painting from the Dixon's collection. His careful depiction of the landscape has allowed art historians to identify the exact location of his vantage point, which overlooks the harbor of Saint-Briac, where the mouth of the Framework River enters into the English Channel. So he painted this location twice, once at low tide and once in the present painting at high tide. So the painting of this scene at low tide is in a private collection, and I couldn't find anything other than a really small black and white image, or else I would have included it, but it looks very similar other than the water level. So this work is indicative of Signac's lifelong enjoyment of depicting the surface of the water. So visible but smooth and even brush strokes in rich cerulean blues dominate the palette. And here and there, ripples and reflections in the sea are accented with emerald greens and magentas. By contrast, the sky is rendered mostly in white tones and soft shades of pink, letting the intense blue of the water take focus. So the cross in this painting is a monument intended as a blessing to fishermen who were the backbone of the regional economy. And it's also painted in the same kind of pinkish white that matches the tenor of the skies overhead. In the foreground, shorter, coarser, stippled strokes form the craggy rocks, while the slender blades of grass are looser and unfold in a breezy manner befitting the coastal atmosphere. So while on the whole, this work is more evocative of Monet and Pisarro, who were major influences in Signac's art at this point, you can already tell by his vivid and imaginative color palette and rigorous paint handling that this is anticipating his ultimate embrace of this pointillist aesthetic. So I'm going backwards. So after Seurat's death, Signac would continue to push the limits of the style, moving further into expressive and even fantastical territory as seen in this well-known portrait of Fenion. His painting continued to evolve throughout the years, though he largely remained committed to divisionism, even as other artists in his circle moved away from that approach by the 1910s. And this is another later painting, so he just really continues to dive into these really vibrant colors, and you can tell that this painting is going to be really influential to someone like Henri Matisse, who is a little younger than him. Okay, so I briefly want to include Camille Pisarro. So we have 2 paintings by Pisarro in our collection at the Dixon, but neither one of these paintings is evocative of Pisarro's embrace of Neo-Impressionism. So that's why I don't want to spend quite as much time discussing him, but I do think he's worth mentioning. So he is the only artist who has the distinction of participating in all 8 of the Impressionist exhibitions. And it was through Camille Pisarro that Paul Signac and Georges Seurat were invited to participate in the final Impressionist exhibition in 1886. Without him, Le Grand Jatte might not have enjoyed the same kind of audience that it did because of their connection to Camille Pisarro. So Pisarro constantly sought to refine his techniques, and he committed himself to the Neo-Impressionist aesthetic in the mid-1880s after he met Georges Seurat and Paul Signac. So Camille Pisarro was invigorated by working with these enthusiastic artists who were a generation younger than he, but he ultimately grew frustrated with the painstaking techniques of the Neo-Impressionist aesthetic because it necessitated more time in the studio and less time outdoors, which Pisarro loved to work outside. And so by the early 1890s, Pisarro had left pointillism behind in favor of a return to the kind of more pure Impressionist aesthetic that we tend to think of his works as. So this painting here is an example of when he's practicing his version of Neo-Impressionism. And then here's another pretty famous painting, A View from His Window. And then this is one of the paintings in the Dixon's collection. So as you can see, by 1894, when he painted this, he's entirely abandoned Neo-Impressionism. The next artist I'll talk about is Maximillian Luc. So he was born in the Montparnasse district of Paris, and he began his artistic career at a young age, but he started out as a wood engraver. And he joined the studio of a very successful engraver where he created woodcuts for magazine publications in both Paris and London, but he continued to take classes in drawing and painting in the evenings while he was working. So in the early 1880s, there were new printing processes that were coming about, and it made wood engraving less popular. So he began to pursue painting with more determination. So Luc actually attended the first Salon des Artistes Indépendants in 1884, and he saw Seurat's painting The Bathers at Asnières. And he was really inspired by that. So he began to do his own experiments with optical color mixing that we have come to associate with Neo-Impressionists. So 3 years later in 1887, Luc exhibited 7 paintings in his first showing at the Salon des Indépendants, including this painting here, Man Washing. So this is really a genre scene of a laborer who's cleansing himself over a basin, but it's rendered in this pointillist aesthetic. And the artist Paul Signac actually immediately bought this work after he saw it. So this auspicious purchase introduced Luc into Signac's Neo-Impressionist circle, and it marked the beginnings of several lifelong friendships for this artist, particularly with Signac and Camille Pisarro. So like many of the other artists who were in this group, Luc strongly identified with the working class, and he was associated with anarchist movements in the 1890s. But these anarchist values were usually more idealistic than actually based in any kind of activism. But in 1894, Luc did serve a brief term in prison along with Felix Fenion, the critic, when this pair, along with dozens of other men, were arrested on suspicion of their involvement in the assassination of the French president. So his charges were ultimately dropped, but his political beliefs did really inform most of the work that he created throughout his career, and his oeuvre is populated with examples of men and women at work. So beginning around 1898, Luc became interested in painting architectural monuments, like the Church of Saint-Gervais-Saint-Protais in Gisors, which is a small commune that's about 40 miles northwest of Paris. He completed 3 paintings of the Gothic church from 3 different perspectives, including this one, which is in the Dixon's collection. So in this painting, Luc depicts this historic structure, and he's looking southward from the Chateau de Gisors, which was itself a medieval landmark. And this is the chateau. So this is up on a hill overlooking the church below, and it still stands today. So his staccato brushwork, bright colors, and pointillist technique are radical stylistic choices for the depiction of the traditional subject matter like this church. So the direction of the shadows in the sky, which is tinged with soft pinks and lavenders, tell us that he depicted this quiet setting at sunset. Lush green trees, shaded deep blue and highlighted in warm gold, populate the foreground as the majestic church towers over everything in the distance. Luc favored juxtaposing historic monuments with everyday modern structures when he painted urban landscapes. And so here, between the church and the chateau where he's standing looking down, you can see roofs and chimneys of residential buildings that peek through. And this is, I wish I had a photograph of this taken around the same time of day. I think it would be a more effective image, but this is just what I could find from Google Maps. So when I figured out where Luc was standing when he painted this work, this was one of the things that helped me, was just looking at images on Google Earth like this, because I knew what the church was, but I was trying to figure out where he painted it from. So you can see what it looks like today. So the church was significantly damaged during World War II. So that's why there's no longer the clock tower on the one end of it. But you can see a lot of these same residential buildings are actually still there, which is pretty interesting that the view is pretty shockingly similar for all the time that's passed. So Luc's work varied stylistically throughout his long career. He lived until 1941, and he was actively working up until the end. So his technique and his brushwork changed, often depending on what kind of subject he painted. But like most of the other artists associated with Neo-Impressionism, he ultimately moved away from the style by the late 1890s. So this is one of the last paintings in which Luc is working with these smaller height brushstrokes like this. Okay, so the last artist I'll talk about is Henri Edmond Cross. So he came from a northern French town and moved to Lille as a child, and he studied at the art academy there before he moved to Paris, and continued working with a pretty traditional painter, but he studied for about 10 years in Paris. So his few surviving works from this period are mainly portraits and still lifes that use a much darker palette and a more severe manner than what we think of with his later paintings. I actually had a really difficult time finding an example of his early work to demonstrate. So that's why I don't have one. So while he was painting on the French Mediterranean coast in the winter of 1883, Cross met Paul Signac. And it was probably through this connection that he became part of this core group of artists who would later be called Neo-Impressionists. So he didn't actually start painting using their technique until the 1890s. So he was really a latecomer to the style, but he was a part of their group and he socialized with them regularly from the beginning. He shared their philosophical and political interests in utopianism and anarchism, and he even contributed lithographs and illustrations to socialist publications. So 1891 was a crucial year, both for Cross the artist and for Neo-Impressionism. So that's the year that Georges Seurat passed away. And this is also the same year that Cross debuted his first painting in which he used the pointillist technique at the Salon des Indépendants. So later that same year in 1891, Cross relocated to the south of France, ultimately making his home in Saint Clair, where he remained for the rest of his life. He had spent his winters in the south of France since 1883 because he had pretty severe arthritis, but then he ultimately had to make the move a permanent one for that same reason. So despite these health issues, moving south proved to be advantageous for his practice, and he got to spend a lot of time with Signac, who had also moved to Saint-Tropez. And Signac and Cross continued to be really good friends and major influences in each other's work, and regularly visited and actually painted alongside each other until Cross passed away. So Signac's Saint-Tropez residence was frequently visited by a wide circle of artists and intellectuals. And so through his connection to Signac, Cross befriended a number of artists who were younger than him, including Henri Matisse and André Derain and Albert Marquet, and other artists who later would be called fauves. So Cross's preferred subjects were peaceful landscapes, seascapes, and idyllic village scenes, all settings that he was regularly encountering in his life in the south of France. Over the course of the 1890s, he began to favor larger rectangular shaped brushstrokes. So he was doing kind of a different pattern of brushstrokes than what other Neo-Impressionists were doing. And his late paintings are known for their decorative mosaic-like quality that resulted from his modified technique with using a little bit longer, kind of more elongated brushstrokes. So owing to his increasing interest in the ornamental patterns of Japanese prints, he sought to incorporate a similar surface pattern into his own paintings. So he's known for his use of bright color, and his pictures generally have this kind of hopeful, happy tone, both of which would be greatly admired by the fauves. So this painting in the Dixon's collection was created just a year before Cross's death. And the subject of the work is the Massif des Morts, which is a forested low mountain range in southeastern France, which is located inland but not far from where Cross lived on the Mediterranean coast. He painted these mountains dozens of times over the course of his career, and at least 3 times from this same vantage point. In this painting, the sharp angular strokes associated with his mature style are slightly softened, and the subtle texture of his brushwork heightens the work's dreamlike quality and adds to the lushness of the scenery. Rounded, fluffy vegetation, which features prominently in the foreground but is scattered throughout the whole landscape, adds a whimsical quality to the composition. So Cross also expanded, well, here's another example of his work where you can see just these really bright colors that he's using. And this one particularly reminds me a lot of the work of Matisse when he's branching into fauvism. So Cross expanded into the medium of watercolor, which I also think is a really interesting take on Neo-Impressionism. And you can see how these vivid colors were super influential to painters, in particular Matisse, who I've mentioned a couple times now. So how does Neo-Impressionism end? So the most productive phase lasted from 1885 to 1894. And you'll remember I've mentioned a couple of times that Seurat passed away in 1891, and that really affected the amount of attention that the artists who painted in this style were getting after Seurat died. Pisarro abandoned the style by the early 1890s, and so he kind of just phased out of it. And Maximillian Luc also started painting in a more impressionist style by the early 1900s. Henri Edmond Cross passed away just a year after he created that painting, so I think 1917. And Paul Signac was really one of the only ones who pressed on with the style pretty much up until his death in the 1930s. But he had moved to Saint-Tropez in the 1890s, so he wasn't as involved with the avant-garde scene of Paris, and therefore not exerting his influence as much as he might have had he remained there. So still, Signac published an essay called From Eugène Delacroix to Neo-Impressionism, and in 1899, and that's considered the manifesto of the movement and the defense of Neo-Impressionism, which is kind of interesting considering this is published about 5 years after the heyday of the style. But a lot of artists throughout Europe read that manifesto and started to experiment with the aesthetic, and you can really see the influence of that in this painting by Matisse, which is considered the painting that kind of heralded the beginning of the art style that we call Fauvism. So that is all I have today. So hopefully people have some questions, and I'm happy to try to answer them.
Thank you, Mallory. That was great. We do have some questions, yes. And if anybody has a question, you can type it in if you'd like.
Should I stop sharing my screen?
Well, just in case you want to go back to something, you can stay on it if you want.
Okay.
So it seems to me that that a lot of art styles were named by critics.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Impressionists were called that because a critic, you know, derogatorily said that. And then we've got the Pointillists that actually refer to themselves as divisionists, but we don't call them that. We call them Pointillists. And so, do you know of a painting style that was actually named by the artists themselves?
Oh my goodness. I'm sure that one exists. I don't know. I know that there were a lot of things that weren't named by the artists themselves, but they kind of liked the terms that were given to them. Maybe if Julie's still here, she could answer this question. I think the Neo-Impressionists liked being called Neo-Impressionists. They didn't have any issue with that term. They just didn't like their aesthetic being referred to as pointillist. And I haven't really seen a very good reason why they disliked it, but they pretty uniformly all did not like that term, even though it's so apt to describe what some of them were doing. Yikes, I don't know, because Fauvism was also named by a critic. Cubism was named by a critic.
Hey, I'm here. I just suggested the Nabi as a group that kind of named themselves.
They did. But that was kind of even like a secret name that they didn't really publicize. So, but they did name themselves.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks for your input, Julie. The public, at first, when Impressionism, you know, appeared on the scene, they hated it so much for the most part, many of them, especially critics, and you know, it just seemed unfinished to them. How did they respond? How did the public respond to these pointillist and neo-impressionist paintings? Were they kind of like, oh, they're just up to that kind of stuff again? Or did they have the same kind of knee-jerk reaction? Or was it still similar enough that they were just like, oh, it's kind of the same kind of thing, but a different flavor of it?
From what I've read, the reaction was really mixed. I think the public didn't really like Neo-Impressionism very much. And critics were really divided. So like Fenion, who named the movement, he was really an admirer of it, and he wasn't the only one. There were a couple of them that liked it, but then there were several who derided it and thought it was terrible. So pretty mixed.
Okay, one thing that I'm just kind of curious about, maybe no one knows the answer to this, but the cross on the rock in Signac's painting that we own, does anyone know if that cross is still there on that rock?
Is it, Julie, you think?
Yes, it's still there. I can try to see if I can get a picture of it and put it in the chat maybe of this.
Is it the same one though? Or is it just there's still a cross?
Oh, I don't know if it's the exact same one, but I'll see if I can dig one up. And
I know it's like a landmark on Google Maps.
Put it in the chat.
Okay. Well, if you find one, we can also do another screen share, and maybe you can share that. But Julie had a good question. How did the artists become friends? Did they go to school together, or did they hang out at the same cafes?
So most of them actually did not go to school together. I think Signac is kind of the glue of the group. He really was, like, it cannot be overstated how social he was, and he would go to everything, and he was constantly meeting people and introducing them to other people. I think most of them, and I'm not really sure how the word was spread, but I'm sure that someone has written about this. When they formed their Society of Independent Artists, that's how most of them met each other. and became acquainted. But then like Signac met Luc because he liked his painting and bought it. So, and then they became really good friends. So they all kind of met in different ways. And I think there's some dispute about when actually for the first time Seurat and Signac met, but we can pinpoint that it was 1884. There are a couple of different theories about how they met each other, but I think what I said today and what's generally accepted is that they met when they were founding the Society of Independent Artists. But it's possible they had met before, just like at a party.
Okay, anyone else have any more questions? And I'm gonna actually stop your screen share now, Mallory, so we can get in the gallery view if we want to and see everybody. Oh, I think Julie found a picture and it's down in the group chat. So it can be downloaded. I'm not sure how to work that, but it can be downloaded.
I don't know if I did that right, but I put it on there and I think you can kind of see the cross in the distance if that opened right. And I misspelled Briac. Sorry, I was trying to save it really quick.
It worked, Julie.
Okay, good.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have any last questions? Well, Patricia says, great presentation, thanks. And it was,
Thanks.
Yes. Wow, what a lot of information. And I got to learn a lot about our permanent collection, which is amazing.
Yeah.
And so hopefully everyone else feels like they got to learn a little bit more about the Dixon and the beautiful art in it. So if you want to, you've got a couple more minutes, you can unmute. And if you have any questions or if you want to say thank you to Mallory.
Thank you, Mallory.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Okay,
Great.
we're getting lots of little applause.
Yeah, really enjoyed it.
Thanks for being a good audience when I can't see you all. I appreciate it.
Hey, Marie.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, everybody. And come back next week. We are going to have an Elvis collector, John Heath, and he is going to show us some of his very rare pieces in his Elvis collection.
Wow. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody. Thanks, Mallory.